Okay, so this video is just going to be an overview of the garden I have here. I'm going to go through each plant that I have and just kind of talk about what it is, how it's been growing, that kind of thing. But before I do that, just some general information about the garden. This is only the second year I've been doing this at all, and the first year that I had this garden, last year with the pandemic, being stuck at home, I decided to do something around the house, and we just had a bunch of plants in containers along this wall back here. You can see we got some herbs there now, and I like that so much we decided to keep going and ended up building all of this. As far as where we are, this area is in what's called Zone 6B in the US. It's determined by the minimum temperature that we get, and that determines what plants we can grow. So about here, the winters are expected to get as cold as minus 18 degrees Celsius, so we can't grow plants year-round. These will all eventually die once it gets cold enough, but we do have nice warm summers, as you can see, and you can actually get a lot done in the growing season that we have here. Okay, so starting with the plants actually away from the garden, my two favorite plants, these are actually peach trees that we got from Costco this year. They mailed them right to us in a box, just like this, with their roots in little pots, and you plant them. We dug a hole about 1 meter across and maybe half a meter deep, filled it up with some good rich soil, and they've actually been growing like crazy. When we got this one, it was just a few inches above the top of this bamboo stake. Now it's way above that, and this one was actually just even with the stake, and now it's way taller than that as well. They're doing pretty well. There's not going to be any peaches this year, except for one that managed to survive on this one. They had several peaches when we got them, but because the planting is kind of stressful for them, they dropped them all shortly after they got in the ground, except for one. This guy managed to hold on. Can see right there, so we'll get to enjoy one peach this year. But even if they hadn't dropped them, I probably would have picked all of them off anyway, because they really shouldn't be putting any energy into fruit this year. Their job is to build up nice healthy roots there under the ground and to get some good growth growing that way. Next year, early in the season, I'll kind of identify which branches I would like for them to keep, which ones seem to be growing strong, and I'll actually prune off a lot of the rest. I'm really looking forward to these guys being fully grown. I'm expecting them to be giving us a good amount of fruit in a couple of years. Okay, going towards the garden. Actually, before we get there, this is kind of related to the peaches. All these little things here are clover that we recently spread all along this wall. I don't know if you can see them down here. And I threw them all into the grass here. So they're actually going to grow into the grass. They won't kill the grass off or anything, but they're going to produce little flowers. Actually, we probably have some, yeah, here. You could even see there was just a bee visiting this one. They produce these little flowers that the bees really like, so there should be plenty of bees buzzing around next year, which will help pollinate the peach trees. And these plants actually also pull nitrogen out of the air via their leaves here. They bring it down into the soil, and then bacteria that they work with in the soil will take that nitrogen and make it available to the other plants growing around. So as those peach trees get bigger and bigger, the clover will kind of be helping them with some natural fertilizer. Should also help the grass grow better. You can kind of see here as we get closer to the garden. We killed off the grass here, and there's a little bit of clover growing. That's not clover. Here we go. We got clover growing here, so I'm just gonna let that be a nice border for the garden. Okay, then on to the garden itself. You can see our rain gauge, so I know how much rain the garden is getting. Don't want to overwater. Have a good variety of plants here. I tried to organize them. The south side here, the lower plants, the north side here, the taller plants, except for that sunflower, which is an exception that I'll talk about. Starting on the north side, you can see these plants here, these lower ones, making a border, and they actually go all the way around, or pretty far around this way. These are just flowers called marigolds. I grew these from seed maybe about a month and a half ago. They haven't produced any flowers yet, but they're getting nice and big. They all look healthy, so I'm hoping that they will start putting out some blossoms soon. They should attract some beneficial insects and also repel some of the pests that you don't want in your garden. I think that they're a good choice. They'll also look nice as a border around the garden. In this side of the garden, to complement them, I'm also growing this here, kind of spaced about 1 foot intervals as you go down. This is an amaranth that will eventually grow to about 1.5 meters tall and should put out these big red, or big burgundy, I guess, flowers that'll also attract beneficial bugs and will produce some edible grain. It's kind of like a quinoa, if you know what that is. So this will be nice too once they get going. They started from seed, so they're a little bit behind the other plants. And then onto this row, the big guys. These are all the tomatoes. Here in these 2 cages, this one and this one, we have determinate tomatoes. These will grow to a set predetermined size and then kind of stop and produce all their fruit. So this one's getting there, as you can see. It hasn't grown that much lately, but there's flowers here, lots of fruits here, lots of tomatoes inside. This one is a cherry tomato. This bigger one here is just a regular tomato. Let's see if I can find some of the fruits. Yeah, there, you can kind of see. Growing really nice, and I'm not pruning them or anything because they're in their cages and because they're already growing to a predetermined height. There's no real reason to be cutting them back and shaping them. I'm just letting them go and fill in their cages. The only things I might take off are some branches like this one here, where they're escaping the cage. We'll see how they do. If it looks like it's gonna fall over, then I might take that branch off. Also, in between the tomatoes, we have all this lettuce. This I grew from seed. Let's see, some of it's getting sheltered in there. I did it like this because lettuce is a cool weather crop. It doesn't want heavy, intense sun beating on it all the time. So in between these tomato plants, the tomatoes are giving it shade and keeping it from getting too warm. Otherwise, it'll just it'll stop producing these nice leaves that I want, and it'll start putting out these big stalks that will make flowers and eventually seeds. Here, another nice big tomato plant. This one is an indeterminate like the other ones in this row, which is why they all have these stakes. This one has these big heavy stakes, probably bigger than you'd want, but lumber's getting very expensive here, so we actually got a deal on these ones. I just went with them even though they're pretty thick. It's growing nicely. This one I am pruning, unlike the determinate tomatoes in that cage. Let me see if I can find... I've actually been doing a good job pruning, so I can't find any suckers on this one. Oh, here you can kind of see. Well, this is the growing tip. It's producing flowers, or it's producing new growth here, and these tomatoes will also produce new growth out of here, which I'm pinching off because I want them to grow straight up. The only things that are coming out of this tomato, it has the main vine, fruit clusters, and then these what are called sun leaves here. A similar one here, a different variety of tomato but still full-sized, not too different from the one next to it. And then you have basil here that I'm growing in between the tomato plants. I was hoping that this would kind of fill in more here as ground cover, but it's also supposed to repel some pests that will eat the tomatoes or eat the tomato plants because of its strong smell, and maybe supposedly enhances the flavor of the tomatoes. We'll see, but still a nice little addition. It's always nice to just be able to come out here and pick basil whenever you need it. And this basil came from seeds, so it's not like it cost a lot of money or anything to grow, just a couple dollars for the whole package of seeds. This tomato is an interesting one. It doesn't look like the others. If you were looking closely at those, they have this shape of leaf. This one doesn't have the spiky parts on the edges. This is actually called potato leaves because they look a lot like potatoes. And I believe that this tomato is actually an heirloom kind, so the fruit is a little bit differently shaped than the other ones. These have been bred to have these nice kind of round fruits like you would see in a supermarket. This tomato hasn't. It's kind of like what you would have seen, you know, a few decades ago before all of this, all these breeding programs took place to give attractively shaped fruit. Here, it's growing kind of funny, but it's nice to have some variety to the tomatoes you're growing. Just interesting, and these will be huge eventually. Then the last ones we have, these are both San Marzano tomatoes. Really, really good for making pasta sauces, that kind of thing. You can see them in there. This one on the left is a little bit further behind because it actually got sprayed by some weed killer or grass killer that we used earlier in the season to kill off the grass on the edge of the garden where we're now putting clover. Not a lot, very, very little. We tried to be careful, but the wind carried some of it and it got set back a few weeks, but with some care it was eventually able to make a recovery. It's doing pretty good now, and it'll definitely be giving us some fruit. You can see it's putting out some flowers right here. One of them's already been fertilized, so it's doing fine now. The last two tomatoes, this other determinate one, growing really nicely in its cage. Haven't pruned it at all, never really needed to touch it or anything. This should be about its final size. You can see it's already got a lot of fruit going. I like this one. And my really, really tall cherry tomato, already taller than me and nearly up to the top of the stake. I actually was able to take some tomatoes from this one this morning, all the way from the bottom, kind of over here, and it's still got more that are ripening nicely. These will be ready to pick probably in a few days. And this plant's kind of giving me some thinking to do because it's only early July and it's already almost at the top of its stake. I'll need to probably cut this growing shoot at the top relatively soon and then let it focus on growing out to the sides. Here you can see I actually cut a sucker off here and it's doing it again. It's making a new sucker. So maybe if there's a lot of growing season left and it's at the top of the stake, I'll just cut the top off and let it grow out of the side from these suckers. These will eventually produce new fruit, given enough time to grow. Here we have cucumbers growing on a trellis. They've filled out the whole bottom here. It's just 4 plants coming out of the ground. Well, you can see that I tied strings around once I picked the 4 plants that I wanted and let them climb up the strings onto the trellis. They filled out the bottom of it pretty good. They'll keep putting out more, and they even, one of them, made it all the way to the top very quickly. Just a couple weeks ago these were barely reaching the bottom, and now this one's made it all the way. Lots of flowers coming out. Some of these are male flowers, which won't produce any fruit. Some of these are female flowers, which will become the fruit. You can kind of see. Maybe I can find one. The female flowers look like they have little cucumbers underneath them. I don't know if I see them right now. Well, anyway, that's how they work. So these ones require bugs like this to fly from flower to flower, grabbing the pollen from the male flowers and moving it to the female ones. Okay. Okay.